There's something quietly unsettling about the way the Tomorrow War introduces itself. And I don't mean the explosions, or the creature design, or even the time travel hook. I mean that very first feeling you get watching the trailer for the first time, when everything looks like a completely normal, almost cozy suburban evening. Christmas lights glowing, people laughing, a football game playing in the background. Just life, happening the way it always does. And then reality splits open in the most matter-of-fact way imaginable. No dramatic buildup, no ominous sky tearing apart with thunder and lightning. Just a group of soldiers dropping into a soccer field in the middle of a World Cup broadcast like they took the wrong exit off a highway that happens to lead through time. And the thing that always sticks with me is not even the spectacle of that moment. It's the confusion. The players stop. The crowd goes silent. The broadcast cuts to chaos. And for a second, you're sitting there thinking, wait, is this supposed to be a prank? A glitch? A viral marketing stunt inside the movie? That uncertainty is exactly what hooks you, because the film understands something really important about modern audiences. We're used to weird things happening, but we're not used to the world explaining them in such a blunt, almost bureaucratic tone. And then the explanation comes, and it's delivered with this eerie calm. These soldiers aren't here by accident. They're not lost. They're not confused. They're here with a purpose, and that purpose is basically the most terrifying elevator pitch you could possibly hear. Humanity is losing a war 30 years in the future, and they need help. Not tomorrow, not eventually, right now. The trailer leans into that idea hard, but what's interesting is how it balances scale with intimacy. You've got this global announcement, government scrambling, entire populations being drafted into a war that technically hasn't even happened yet. But the way it's framed, especially through Chris Pratt's character, Dan Forrester, it never feels like some abstract sci-fi concept floating above human emotion. It feels immediate, personal, like something that could knock on your door tomorrow and hand you a notice that says, "You're needed, pack your bags. Also, you probably won't come back." And Pratt plays that initial disbelief in a way that's a little more grounded than you might expect if you only know him from his more comedic roles. There's a moment in the trailer where he's watching the announcement, and you can see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Not heroism, not bravado, just a guy trying to process something that makes absolutely no sense. That's where the trailer really starts to pull you in, because it doesn't rush past that reaction. It lingers just long enough for you to sit with it. Then, almost like flipping a switch, the tone shifts into preparation. Training sequences, military briefings, the mechanics of this whole time travel draft system. And what I find fascinating is how the trailer chooses to reveal information. It doesn't dump everything on you in one go. Instead, it gives you fragments, just enough to build a picture, but never enough to feel comfortable. You learn that people are being sent forward in time, that survival rates are not great, and that whatever they're fighting is not something conventional armies were ever designed to handle. And that's when the imagery starts to get heavier. Urban environments turned into war zones, helicopters weaving between collapsing buildings, soldiers firing into darkness at something you can't quite see yet. There's a deliberate restraint in how the creatures, the white spikes, are introduced. You get flashes, movement, glimpses of something fast, aggressive, almost animalistic, but clearly not natural. The trailer understands that showing too much too early would kill the tension, so it teases just enough to let your imagination fill in the blanks. What really stands out, though, is how the trailer uses contrast. One moment you're in a quiet living room with a family trying to hold on to normalcy. The next, you're dropped into a battlefield where normal doesn't exist anymore. And it's not just visual contrast, it's emotional. There's this underlying question running through the entire thing. What does it mean to fight for a future you haven't lived yet? That's not a typical action movie motivation. Usually, it's about saving the present, protecting loved ones, stopping an immediate threat. Here, it's something more abstract, almost philosophical. There's a line in the trailer, delivered with a kind of exhausted urgency, that hints at the stakes without spelling everything out. Humanity isn't just losing, it's on the brink of extinction. And suddenly, all those explosive set pieces, all the high-concept sci-fi elements, they start to feel less like spectacle and more like inevitability. Like this is the only option left, no matter how insane it sounds. As the trailer builds momentum, it starts layering in more character-driven moments. Dan's relationship with his daughter, the weight of leaving his family behind, the uncertainty of whether he'll ever see them again. These aren't long scenes. They're quick, almost fleeting, but they're placed very deliberately between the action beats, like emotional checkpoints. And that's what keeps the whole thing from feeling hollow. You're not just watching people fight monsters, you're watching people make impossible choices. Then there's the escalation. The trailer doesn't plateau. It keeps climbing. Bigger explosions, more chaotic battles, clearer glimpses of the enemy. And when you finally get a proper look at the white spikes, it's almost a shock, not because they're completely unexpected, but because of how aggressively they're presented. Fast, relentless, overwhelming. They don't move like traditional movie monsters. There's a kind of unpredictability to them that makes every encounter feel like it could go wrong in an instant. And right when you think the trailer has shown its hand, it pivots again. It starts hinting at something deeper, something beyond just surviving the war in the future. There's this suggestion that maybe the real solution isn't just fighting harder, but understanding the enemy, figuring out where it all began. It's subtle, but it's there. And it adds another layer to the narrative that makes you lean in a little closer. By the time the trailer reaches its final stretch, it's operating on pure momentum. Quick cuts, rising music, overlapping dialogue, all building toward that last emotional beat. And instead of ending on the biggest explosion or the most visually impressive moment, it pulls back just slightly and focuses on something quieter, something human. A look, a line, a decision that carries more weight than any CGI spectacle. And that choice says a lot about what the movie is trying to be. Yes, it's a big, loud, high-concept sci-fi action film. There's no denying that. But underneath all of that, there's this steady current of something more reflective. It's asking questions about responsibility, about sacrifice, about how far people are willing to go when the stakes are literally everything. Watching the trailer, you get the sense that it's not just trying to sell you on action sequences or visual effects. It's trying to sell you on an idea that the future isn't some distant, abstract concept, but something that can reach back and demand something from you right now. And whether or not the movie fully delivers on that promise is a conversation for later. But as a piece of marketing, as a first impression, it's surprisingly effective at planting that seed. Because when the screen finally cuts to black and the title appears, you're not just thinking about aliens or time travel or explosions. You're thinking about that initial moment, the one where everything was normal, and then suddenly it wasn't. And how quickly everything changed after that. And the moment you step past that first impression, once the trailer fades out and you're left sitting there with that uneasy mix of curiosity and adrenaline, your mind almost automatically starts trying to piece together how something like this even exists in the first place. Because the Tomorrow War doesn't just feel like another entry in the long line of alien invasion movies. It feels like it's borrowing DNA from a bunch of different eras of blockbuster filmmaking and stitching them together into something that's trying very hard to be both familiar and slightly off balance at the same time. And I keep thinking about how the trailer leans into that sense of dislocation, not just time travel as a concept, but time as something fragile, something that can be bent and manipulated by people who are desperate enough. There's a quiet boldness in that premise. You're not just dealing with scientists in labs or secret government experiments hidden in bunkers. You're dealing with an entire future society, essentially knocking on the door of the present and saying, we need bodies. Not volunteers in the traditional sense, not trained elites, but ordinary people pulled from their lives and dropped into a war they don't understand. That idea alone could carry a film if it's handled with enough weight. And the trailer seems very aware of that. It doesn't rush past the human cost. You see it in the faces of people being drafted, in the hesitation, in the forced acceptance. There's a shot, just a brief one, where families are saying goodbye, and it's not framed like some heroic send-off. It's awkward, uncertain, almost numb, like nobody really knows what they're supposed to feel in a situation that has no precedent. And then you start noticing how the trailer uses scale in a very deliberate way. It keeps pulling you back and forth between the massive and the intimate. 1 second, you're looking at entire cities under siege, and the next, you're locked into a close-up of Chris Pratt's face as he's trying to process the reality of what he's about to step into. That push and pull creates a rhythm that keeps you engaged because it never lets you settle into just one mode of viewing. You're constantly adjusting, emotionally and visually. There's also something interesting about how the military aspect is portrayed. It's not overly glorified, at least not in the way some action films tend to lean into. There's competence, sure, and there's structure, but there's also a sense of improvisation, like the rules are being written in real time, because nobody has ever fought this kind of enemy before. The weapons look familiar, the tactics feel grounded, but the context makes everything seem slightly inadequate. And that's where the creature design, even in its limited exposure in the trailer, starts to do a lot of heavy lifting. The white spikes aren't presented as just another obstacle to overcome. They feel like a force, fast, unpredictable, overwhelming in numbers. The way they move, the way they attack, it all suggests something that doesn't follow the usual cinematic logic of learn the pattern, exploit the weakness. Instead, it feels chaotic, almost like nature at its most violent and uncontrollable. What I find particularly effective is how the trailer doesn't try to fully explain them. It hints, it teases, but it never stops to give you a clean, digestible breakdown. And that restraint actually makes them more intimidating, because your imagination fills in the gaps with something far worse than any quick exposition could deliver. At the same time, there's this underlying thread that keeps surfacing, this idea that the real story might not just be about fighting these creatures, but about understanding how things got to this point. You catch glimpses of research facilities, conversations that sound more scientific than tactical, moments where the focus shifts from survival to discovery. And it makes you wonder if the film is setting up something a little more layered than a straightforward war narrative. Then there's the emotional core, which the trailer keeps circling back to without ever overstating it. Dan's relationship with his daughter is clearly positioned as the anchor, but it's not presented in a heavy-handed way. It's more like a quiet undercurrent that gives everything else context. Every decision he makes, every risk he takes, it all ties back to that connection, even if the trailer doesn't spell it out in explicit terms. And that subtlety is important because it prevents the emotional beats from feeling like interruptions to the action. Instead, they feel integrated, like they're part of the same momentum. You're not switching between story mode and action mode. You're experiencing both at the same time. As the trailer continues to build, you start to notice how it plays with expectations. There are moments that look like they're setting up familiar tropes. The reluctant hero, the ragtag group of soldiers, the last stand against impossible odds. But then they're framed in a way that feels slightly off. Like the film is aware of those conventions and is trying to push against them just enough to keep things interesting. And that tension between familiarity and unpredictability becomes one of the trailer's strongest assets. It gives you enough to hold on to, enough recognizable elements to ground you, but it keeps shifting the perspective just enough that you never feel completely comfortable predicting what's coming next. By the time you reach the final stretch, the trailer is operating almost like a controlled avalanche. Everything is moving faster, louder, more intense, but it never completely loses its sense of focus. The visuals become more chaotic, the stakes feel higher, the glimpses of the future war grow more desperate, and yet there's still that thread of humanity running through it, keeping everything connected. And when it finally pulls back, when it gives you that last lingering image or line before cutting to black, it doesn't feel like a conclusion. It feels like an invitation to step into a story that's bigger than the pieces you've been shown, to find out how all these fragments come together. Because at the end of the day, what the trailer really accomplishes isn't just generating excitement. It creates a kind of curiosity that lingers. It makes you want to understand the rules of this world, to see how these characters navigate something so fundamentally broken, and to find out whether there's actually a way to change a future that already seems set in stone. What's fascinating is how that curiosity doesn't just come from the big ideas. It comes from the way the trailer quietly hints at the mechanics behind everything without ever turning into a lecture. And that's a delicate balance most high-concept films struggle with. You can feel the world building happening in the background, almost like it's trusting the audience to keep up, rather than stopping to explain every rule. There's this brief sense of procedure that slips in. Medical screenings, age restrictions, people being evaluated before they're even allowed to go forward in time. And that detail, it might seem small, but it actually opens up a whole layer of implication. It suggests that the future isn't just grabbing anyone they can. They've learned something, they've figured out patterns, survival probabilities, maybe even the kind of person who stands a chance against whatever they're facing. That alone adds weight to the whole concept, because it means this isn't chaos for the sake of chaos. There's structure inside the desperation, and the trailer lets that idea breathe without drawing a big circle around it. You just absorb it. You start to realize that the people being sent forward aren't necessarily the best soldiers. They're the most necessary ones, based on criteria we don't fully understand yet. That's unsettling in its own way, because it implies a level of calculation that goes beyond heroism. It's almost clinical. At the same time, there's this growing sense that the future war isn't just losing. It's already lost in every way that matters. The tone of the soldiers who come back, the urgency in their voices, the way they talk about what's happening. It doesn't feel like a battle that can be turned around with one big victory. It feels like a slow collapse that's been happening for years, and now they're reaching backward in time as a last, almost desperate attempt to change something that might already be inevitable. And that's where the trailer starts to lean into something a little more existential. not in a heavy philosophical monologue kind of way, but in the way it frames certain moments. There's a shot of the future, ruined landscapes, empty streets, remnants of a world that used to function. And it doesn't linger long, but it's enough to plant a question in your mind. If this is where everything is heading, what does fighting even mean at that point? Are they trying to win, or are they just trying to buy time? That ambiguity is powerful because it shifts the stakes from something simple and immediate to something much more complicated. It's not just about survival in the present moment. It's about whether survival even has a clear definition anymore. And then, layered into all of that, you've got the personal stakes continuing to build in a way that feels increasingly heavy the more you think about it. Dan isn't just stepping into a war. He's stepping into a future that directly connects to his own life, his own family. And the trailer hints at that connection in ways that are subtle but impossible to ignore. There are moments where timelines seem to overlap emotionally, if not literally, where the idea of cause and effect starts to feel less linear and more intertwined. It's one of those things where you don't get the full picture from the trailer, but you can sense that it's there, waiting to be explored. And that sense of something deeper beneath the surface is what keeps the whole thing from feeling like just another spectacle-driven experience. Visually, the trailer keeps evolving as it goes too. Early on, everything feels grounded, almost mundane, but as it progresses, the imagery becomes more extreme, more disorienting. The future isn't just a darker version of the present, it's something fundamentally altered. The color palette shifts, the environments feel harsher, less forgiving. There's a texture to it that suggests not just destruction, but abandonment. Like the world didn't just fall apart, it was left behind. And the action sequences, even in these quick glimpses, seem to be designed around that idea. They're not clean, choreographed set pieces where everything unfolds with precision. They're messy, chaotic, unpredictable. You get the sense that the characters are constantly reacting rather than executing a plan, which adds a layer of tension that's hard to fake. The sound design, even in the trailer, plays a big role in that. The way the creatures are heard before they're fully seen, the way gunfire echoes in open spaces, the way silence creeps in between bursts of chaos. It all contributes to this feeling that the environment itself is part of the threat. It's not just about what's attacking them, it's about where they are, how exposed they are, how little control they actually have. And through all of that, the trailer keeps threading in these small human moments that ground everything. A glance between characters, a line delivered under pressure that reveals more than it seems, a hesitation before stepping into something dangerous. These are the details that give the larger narrative weight, because they remind you that behind all the spectacle, there are people trying to make sense of something that defies logic. By the time you reach the final beats, there's this strange duality in how you're feeling. On one hand, you're hooked by the scale, the intensity, the sheer ambition of what's being presented. On the other hand, there's this lingering unease, not just about whether the characters will survive, but about what survival even looks like in a story like this. And that's probably the most interesting thing the trailer does. It doesn't promise resolution. It doesn't give you the comfort of a clear path forward. Instead, it leaves you with questions about time, about consequence, about the cost of trying to fix something that might already be broken beyond repair. So when the title appears again in your mind after everything you've just seen, it carries a different weight than it did at the beginning. It's not just a catchy phrase or a piece of marketing. It feels like a warning, like something inevitable that's already in motion, whether anyone is ready for it or not. And the more you sit with that feeling, the more the trailer starts to reveal itself as something carefully engineered rather than just a collection of cool moments stitched together. Because every beat, every cut, every choice of what to show and what to hold back, it's all building toward a very specific kind of anticipation that isn't just about what happens next, but how does something like this even resolve? That's a much harder question to answer in a film like The Tomorrow War, because once you introduce time travel into a narrative that's already dealing with extinction level stakes, you're essentially playing with two ticking clocks at the same time. There's the immediate danger, the war in the future, the creatures, the survival rate that keeps getting hinted at in increasingly uncomfortable ways. And then there's the larger, almost invisible clock, the one that's counting down toward whatever decision or discovery might actually change the outcome. And the trailer dances between those two pressures without ever letting one overshadow the other. You'll get a burst of intense action, soldiers scrambling, gunfire erupting, something moving too fast in the shadows, and then it'll pivot, almost mid-breath, into a quieter moment that feels like it's carrying a completely different kind of weight. A conversation, a realization, a look that suggests someone understands something the audience doesn't yet. That contrast is where the tension really lives, because it keeps you from settling into a single expectation. You're not just waiting for the next explosion, you're waiting for the next piece of the puzzle, even if you don't fully know what that puzzle looks like yet. And then there's the way the trailer subtly plays with the idea of inevitability. You start to notice it in the language, in the tone of certain lines, in the way characters react to information that should feel shocking, but instead feels confirmed. Like they've already accepted a version of the future where things go wrong, and now they're just trying to navigate within that reality rather than overturn it completely. That's a tricky emotional space to sit in, especially for a mainstream action film, because audiences are usually conditioned to expect a clear path toward victory, even if it's a difficult one. But here, the trailer seems almost comfortable with the idea that victory might not look the way we're used to. It might not even be victory in the traditional sense. And that uncertainty extends to the characters as well. You can see it in the way they carry themselves, in the way they respond to orders, in the way they interact with each other. There's camaraderie, sure, but there's also a kind of underlying resignation, like everyone understands the odds and has made a quiet peace with them. What's interesting is how Chris Pratt's performance, even in these brief trailer moments, seems to sit right in the middle of that tension. He's not portrayed as someone who's fully embraced the situation, nor is he completely overwhelmed by it. He's somewhere in between, processing, adapting, trying to hold on to something personal while being pulled into something much larger than himself. And that middle ground is important because it gives the audience a point of entry. You're not watching a larger-than-life hero who already knows what to do. You're watching someone who's figuring it out as he goes, which makes the stakes feel more immediate, more relatable. As the trailer continues to layer in more visuals from the future, you start to get a clearer sense of just how far things have deteriorated. It's not just isolated battle zones. It's entire regions that look unrecognizable, stripped of anything that once made them functional. Buildings aren't just damaged, they're hollowed out, like shells of something that used to matter. And the way the camera moves through those spaces adds to that feeling. It's not always steady or controlled. There's a kind of urgency to it, like it's trying to keep up with events that are constantly threatening to spiral out of control. That kinetic energy feeds directly into the action sequences, making them feel less like set pieces and more like fragments of a much larger ongoing struggle. The creatures, when they're finally shown more clearly, reinforce that sense of chaos. They don't pause. They don't posture. They don't give the characters time to react in a neat cinematic way. They attack. They overwhelm. They move on. And that lack of hesitation makes them feel less like antagonists and more like a force of nature, something that doesn't need a motive to be dangerous. But even with all that intensity, the trailer never completely abandons its emotional thread. It keeps circling back to those quieter moments, those glimpses of connection and consequence that remind you what's actually at stake beyond survival. Because survival, on its own, can be a pretty hollow goal if there's nothing left to return to. And that's where the idea of the future becomes almost paradoxical. The characters are fighting for something they haven't experienced yet, something that might not even exist if they fail. It's a concept that's easy to state, but harder to feel. And the trailer does a surprisingly effective job of making it resonate without over-explaining it. By the time everything reaches its peak, there's this sense that the film isn't just building toward a climax, it's building toward a revelation. Not necessarily a twist in the traditional sense, but a moment where the pieces start to align, where the audience begins to understand the full scope of what's been set in motion. And yet, even in those final moments, the trailer holds something back. It doesn't give you the full picture. It doesn't show you exactly how things connect or resolve. It leaves gaps, intentional ones, that keep your mind turning long after it's over. So you're left sitting there, not just thinking about the action or the spectacle, but about the structure of the story itself, about how all these elements, time travel, alien invasion, personal stakes, global consequences, are going to come together in a way that feels coherent and satisfying. And that's the real hook. Not just the promise of excitement, but the promise of understanding. Because when a trailer can make you feel like there's something to figure out, something to piece together beyond what's immediately visible, it creates a different kind of engagement, one that lingers, one that pulls you back in even after the screen goes dark. And sitting there with all of that swirling in your head, the scale, the uncertainty, the emotional undercurrent, you start to realize the trailer isn't just selling a story. It's quietly setting expectations about tone, about pacing, about what kind of experience this is going to be once you actually press play. Because there's a difference between a film that just wants to impress you and one that wants to occupy your thoughts for a while. And this preview leans toward the latter more than you might expect from something that, on the surface, looks like pure blockbuster fuel. What really lingers is how deliberately it avoids giving you a clean emotional release. Most trailers, especially in this genre, are built like a wave. You rise, you peak, and then you crash into some big, satisfying final beat that leaves you energized. Here, the energy is there, no question, but it doesn't resolve in a way that feels complete. It kind of hangs, like a question left mid-sentence. And that choice matters, because it mirrors the core idea at the heart of the film, a future that's unfinished, unstable, still being written. You're not stepping into a story that already knows how it ends. You're stepping into something that feels like it's still trying to figure that out. There's also something worth noticing in how the trailer handles its sense of identity. It doesn't lock itself into a single genre tone. One moment, it feels almost like grounded science fiction. People reacting to an impossible situation with a kind of pragmatic disbelief. The next, it leans into full-scale action, with all the intensity and chaos that comes with it. And then, just as quickly, it pulls back into something more introspective, almost reflective. That constant shifting could easily feel messy if it wasn't controlled, but here it feels intentional. like the film is trying to reflect the instability of its own premise. When your entire concept is built around time being disrupted, cause and effect being bent out of shape, it makes sense for the tone to feel a little fluid, a little unpredictable, and through all of that, the human element never completely disappears. Even when the visuals get bigger, louder, more overwhelming, there's always something grounding you. Some reminder that this isn't just about spectacle. It's about people trying to hold on to meaning in a situation that keeps stripping it away. You see it in the way characters look at each other in the middle of chaos, like they're trying to communicate something that words can't quite carry. You hear it in the lines that slip through the noise, not as grand declarations, but as small, almost fragile attempts to make sense of what's happening. Those moments don't dominate the trailer, but they anchor it in a way that gives everything else context. And then there's the pacing, which is more thoughtful than it initially appears. It's easy to get caught up in the fast cuts and the escalating action, but if you pay attention, there's a rhythm underneath it that feels almost measured. It knows when to speed up, when to slow down, when to let an image sit just long enough for it to register before moving on. That kind of control suggests a film that's aware of its own scale and isn't afraid to take a breath when it needs to. And that's not always a given in movies like this. Sometimes the pressure to keep things constantly exciting can flatten everything into the same emotional note. Here, at least based on the trailer, there's an effort to create variation, to let different moments carry different kinds of weight. As everything winds down, there's this subtle shift in how you're processing what you've seen. At the beginning, you're reacting, taking in the premise, the visuals, the shock of that initial disruption. By the end, you're reflecting. You're connecting dots, even if they're incomplete. You're thinking about how these pieces might fit together, what kind of journey they're pointing toward. And that shift is what makes the trailer stick. It doesn't just leave you with images, it leaves you with a feeling that's harder to define. A mix of anticipation and unease, curiosity and skepticism, excitement, and something a little more contemplative. Because underneath all the noise, all the spectacle, there's a question that keeps echoing. If you had the chance to fight for a future you might never see, would you take it? And more importantly, what would that cost you? Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, in terms of the life you're leaving behind. The trailer doesn't answer that. It doesn't even try to. It just places the question in front of you and lets it sit there, unresolved. And maybe that's the most effective thing it does. It doesn't just show you a movie. It invites you to think about it, to wrestle with it a little, to carry it with you beyond those few minutes of footage. And in a landscape where so many previews feel interchangeable, that kind of lingering impact is rare. By the time you come back to the title one last time in your mind, it doesn't feel like a promise of action anymore. It feels like a statement about consequence, about time catching up with you, whether you're ready or not. And once that idea really settles in, this sense that time isn't just something passing in the background, but something actively pressing forward, demanding a response, you start to feel the story itself begin to unfold in a way that's less about spectacle and more about inevitability. Like everything that happens from here is already in motion, whether anyone fully understands it or not. It begins quietly, almost deceptively so, grounded in a version of normal life that feels familiar enough to lower your guard. Dan Forrester isn't introduced as some larger-than-life figure. He's a high school biology teacher, a guy who once had bigger ambitions, maybe still carries them somewhere under the surface, but has settled into something more stable, more predictable. There's a softness to those early moments, family time, conversations that don't carry the weight of the world yet, a sense that life, while not perfect, is at least manageable. And that's important, because when the shift happens, it doesn't just disrupt the world, it disrupts that sense of personal equilibrium. The arrival of the future soldiers isn't framed like a distant crisis. It's immediate, invasive. 1 second there's celebration, the next there's confusion, fear, disbelief spreading through a crowd that has no context for what they're seeing. When the explanation comes that humanity is losing a war decades ahead, that reinforcements are needed now, it lands with a kind of blunt force. Not because the idea is shouted or dramatized excessively, but because of how matter-of-fact it is. There's no cushioning it, no attempt to soften the reality. It's presented as a problem with a single urgent solution. People must go. And almost instantly, the world begins to reorganize itself around that idea. Governments align in ways that feel less like cooperation and more like necessity. Systems are put into place to draft civilians, to evaluate who can be sent forward, to manage something that has no historical precedent. There's a procedural quality to it that makes it feel disturbingly plausible. Like if something like this did happen, this is exactly how it would unfold. Quickly, efficiently, with just enough explanation to keep things moving. Dan watches all of this from the outside at first, like everyone else. There's skepticism, of course, doubt, the kind of instinctive resistance that comes from being asked to accept something that defies logic. But that resistance doesn't last long, because the evidence is undeniable. The soldiers are real. The urgency in their voices isn't something you can fake. And as more information comes out, the situation becomes harder and harder to dismiss. Then comes the draft. It's handled with a kind of cold precision that strips away any illusion of choice. Names are called. People are selected based on criteria that isn't fully explained, but clearly calculated. There are rules, age limits, health requirements, things that determine whether someone is even eligible to be sent forward. And when Dan's name comes up, it doesn't feel like a heroic call to action. It feels like a sentence. There's a moment, quiet, almost understated, where the reality of that hits him. Not in some dramatic breakdown, but in the way he processes it internally. The way his focus shifts. The way everything that mattered before suddenly feels fragile, temporary. His daughter, his wife, the life he's built. All of it now exists under the shadow of something he can't control. The preparation phase doesn't waste time. Recruits are gathered, briefed, processed. They're told what little the future knows about the enemy, about the conditions they'll be stepping into. The survival rate is mentioned, almost casually, but it hangs in the air like something heavier than any weapon they're being handed. And what's striking is how unprepared most of them are. These aren't seasoned soldiers. They're civilians, pulled from different walks of life, trying to absorb information that feels incomplete at best. There's training, but it's rushed, functional rather than comprehensive, enough to give them a chance, but not enough to make them confident. Dan moves through this phase with a kind of focused uncertainty. He listens, he learns, but there's always that underlying question. How do you prepare for something you've never seen? How do you train for an enemy that doesn't follow any known pattern? And then, almost before anyone feels ready, the deployment begins. The mechanism itself, the jump forward in time, is presented with a mix of scientific explanation and practical urgency. It's not treated like magic. There are rules, limitations, things that can go wrong. And that's exactly what happens. When Dan and his group are sent forward, the transition isn't smooth. It's chaotic, disorienting. Coordinates are off. The landing point isn't secure. Instead of arriving in a controlled environment, they're dropped into a situation that's already falling apart. And that's the first real taste of the future. It's not a battlefield in the traditional sense. It's a collapse in progress. Buildings are damaged or abandoned, infrastructure barely holding together, the remnants of a world that used to function now repurposed for survival. There's no clear front line, no defined territory, just pockets of resistance trying to hold against something that keeps pushing forward. The disorientation isn't just physical, it's psychological. Everything moves faster than expected. The rules they were briefed on don't seem to apply in the way they imagined. Communication is fragmented. Orders are given, but they feel reactive rather than strategic, like the people in charge are constantly adjusting to a situation that refuses to stabilize. And then the enemy makes itself known in a way that removes any remaining illusion of control. The first encounter isn't framed as a clean cinematic reveal. It's sudden, overwhelming. Movement in places that should be empty. Sounds that don't match anything familiar. And when the white spikes finally come into view, it's not with dramatic buildup, it's with impact. They're faster than expected, more aggressive, less predictable. They don't hesitate, don't give space, don't follow patterns that can be easily learned in the middle of chaos. They attack in ways that feel instinctive, almost like they're designed to exploit confusion. And the reaction from the recruits says everything. Panic, hesitation, fragmented attempts to respond. Some try to follow their training, others freeze, others act on instinct. It's not coordinated, not controlled. It's survival in its rawest form. Dan is pulled into that chaos immediately. There's no adjustment period, no gradual escalation. 1 second he's trying to orient himself, the next he's fighting to stay alive. And what stands out isn't some sudden transformation into a perfect soldier. It's the struggle, the effort to adapt in real time, to process threats as they're happening, to make decisions without having the luxury of certainty. Around him, the situation deteriorates quickly. People are lost. Plans fall apart. The environment itself becomes part of the danger, with structures collapsing, escape routes disappearing, every option carrying risk. And yet, through all of that, there's a thread of purpose that begins to emerge. Orders aren't just about surviving the immediate encounter. There's a mission, something specific that needs to be accomplished, something that goes beyond just holding the line. It's not fully explained yet, not in a way that makes everything clear, but it's enough to shift the focus. This isn't just a defensive war. There's an objective, something the future believes could make a difference. And as Dan starts to move toward that objective, still surrounded by chaos, still adapting to a world that feels fundamentally broken, you can sense the story narrowing slightly. Not in scope, but in direction. Like all the noise, all the confusion is beginning to funnel into something more defined. Not clarity exactly, but momentum. That momentum doesn't feel clean or reassuring. It feels like being carried by a current you didn't choose, something pulling you forward, whether you've caught your breath yet or not. And the moment Dan starts moving with it instead of against it, you can feel the story tightening its grip, focusing less on the shock of arrival and more on the reality of staying alive long enough to understand what any of this actually means. Because once that initial chaos settles, if settles is even the right word for something that still feels like it could explode again at any second, the survivors begin to orient themselves around the mission, and that's where the film starts to quietly shift gears. It's no longer just about reacting. It's about following through. The objective they've been dropped into isn't random. There's a research facility still operating in the future timeline, barely holding together, and it represents something fragile but essential: knowledge. Not just about the enemy, but about a possible way to stop them. And that idea that there might be a solution hidden somewhere in all this devastation becomes the first real thread of hope the story offers. But it's a cautious kind of hope. The kind that comes with conditions, with risks, with the understanding that even getting close to it might cost more than anyone is prepared to pay. As Dan and the remaining soldiers push toward that facility, the environment keeps reminding them how unstable everything is. Streets aren't just empty, they're unpredictable. Structures that look intact can collapse without warning. Every movement feels like it has to be calculated, even when there's no time to calculate anything. And what's interesting is how quickly the idea of normal disappears, not just for Dan, but for the audience as well. You stop expecting safety. You stop looking for clear boundaries between danger and calm. Everything blends together into this constant state of alertness where even silence feels like a warning. When they finally make contact with the people running the operation in the future, there's no sense of relief waiting for them. No warm welcome, no moment to regroup. Instead, there's urgency layered on top of exhaustion. The people who've been fighting this war for years don't have the energy to explain everything from the beginning. They give just enough information to keep things moving. And that's where one of the more emotionally charged elements starts to surface, not in a loud, dramatic reveal, but in a way that feels almost quietly devastating once it clicks into place. Dan's connection to this future isn't just theoretical. It's personal in a way that reframes everything he thought he understood about why he's here. The film doesn't rush that realization. It lets it unfold in fragments, in conversations that carry more weight the more you think about them. There's a kind of emotional dissonance there, trying to process a relationship that technically hasn't happened yet, trying to reconcile who you are with who you might become. And that internal conflict starts to run parallel to the external one. On one side, there's the mission, the search for a way to neutralize the white spikes, to find something that can turn the tide even slightly. On the other, there's this deeply personal thread that keeps pulling Dan in a different direction, forcing him to confront questions about his own life, his choices, the future he's been unknowingly moving toward. Meanwhile, the research itself becomes a focal point. There's evidence that the creatures aren't invincible, that there are biological vulnerabilities that could be exploited, but identifying those vulnerabilities is one thing. Isolating them, weaponizing them, deploying them in a way that actually makes a difference, that's something else entirely. And every step of that process is under pressure. Time isn't just limited, it's collapsing. The future isn't holding the line, it's losing ground. Resources are stretched thin. People are running out of options. So even the act of studying the enemy feels like a race against something that's already ahead. There's a sequence, tense, tightly wound, where they attempt to capture a live specimen for testing. And it's one of those moments where everything the film has been building starts to converge. The unpredictability of the creatures, the fragility of the human effort, the thin margin for error. It all comes together in a situation that feels like it could unravel instantly. And when things do go wrong, and they do, because this story doesn't shy away from that, it's not presented as a shocking twist. It's almost expected. Like the film is reminding you that in a scenario like this, failure isn't the exception. It's part of the process. But even in failure, there's progress. Pieces of information are gathered, connections are made, the outline of a potential solution starts to take shape. It's incomplete, fragile, but it's there. And that's where the emotional stakes start to deepen even further, because now the question isn't just, can they survive? It's, can they carry this solution back? Can they take something from this broken future and bring it into the present in a way that actually changes the outcome? That idea introduces a new layer of tension because it reframes the mission entirely. The future might not be saved by what happens there. It might be saved by what's brought back. And suddenly, every decision carries more weight. Every risk has a broader consequence. It's not just about the people in that moment. It's about everyone who hasn't even been affected yet. As the situation continues to deteriorate around them, as the pressure mounts and the window for action narrows, the story leans harder into that sense of urgency. Not in a frantic, chaotic way, but in a focused, almost relentless progression towards something that feels both necessary and uncertain. And Dan, caught between the mission and his own personal reckoning, starts to shift in a way that feels earned rather than forced. He's not becoming a different person overnight, but he's adapting, prioritizing, understanding what matters in a way that's shaped by everything he's seen and everything he's about to lose if this doesn't work. The world around him continues to collapse, the threat never really receding, always just out of frame or just about to reappear. And yet there's this forward motion that never completely stops. Even when things fall apart, even when plans fail, there's always something pushing the story ahead. Not toward safety, but toward possibility. And that possibility, fragile as it is, starts to feel like the only thing holding everything together. Because once you understand that the future itself might not be salvageable, the focus shifts entirely to what can still be changed, what can still be carried back, and whether that sliver of a chance is enough to justify everything it's going to cost. The deeper Dan gets into that reality, the more the lines begin to blur, not just between past and future, but between purpose and consequence. What started as a mission defined by orders and structure slowly becomes something more personal, more complicated, because now he isn't just fighting to complete an objective. He's fighting to preserve something that hasn't happened yet, something that exists more as potential than memory. And that's where the emotional weight really starts to settle in, because the future version of the world he's standing in isn't just broken, it's intimate in a way that makes it harder to detach from. The people here aren't strangers anymore. They're connected to him in ways that make every loss feel heavier, every decision more difficult to compartmentalize. At the center of all this is the growing understanding of the white spikes themselves, not just as a threat, but as a puzzle that might finally have an answer. The research team has been chasing that answer for years, working with whatever scraps of data they can gather in the middle of a war that doesn't slow down long enough to make discovery easy. And now, with the pieces Dan and the others have helped bring together, there's something tangible taking shape. A toxin. Not a guaranteed solution, not some instant victory, but a weapon that could target the creatures, in a way nothing else has managed to do. It's experimental, incomplete, but it represents a shift from reacting to the enemy to potentially controlling the outcome. But even that breakthrough comes with its own complications. Testing it requires access to the creatures under controlled conditions, something that's incredibly difficult when control itself is such a fragile concept in this environment. Every attempt to move forward carries the risk of drawing more attention, of triggering another wave of attacks that could wipe out everything they've built. And the film leans into that tension without rushing it. You feel the pressure in every step, every decision to proceed, every calculation about whether the risk is worth it. There's no sense of certainty, no moment where the characters suddenly feel like they've got everything under control. It's all provisional, all dependent on things not going wrong in a world where things go wrong constantly. As the situation escalates, the connection between Dan and this future becomes even harder to ignore. It's no longer something he can compartmentalize or push aside in favor of the mission. It's right there, influencing how he sees everything, how he weighs his options, how he defines what success even looks like. Because success isn't just about defeating the white spikes anymore. It's about what kind of future is left behind if they do. It's about whether the choices being made now are creating something worth saving or just delaying an outcome that's already set in motion. And that question lingers even as the action intensifies, because the film doesn't separate its emotional stakes from its physical ones. They're happening at the same time, feeding into each other, making every moment feel layered in a way that goes beyond simple survival. There's a point where everything starts to converge: the research, the mission, the personal stakes, and it creates this sense that something decisive is about to happen. Not in a clean, predictable way, but in that messy, uncertain way the film has been building toward from the beginning. The facility itself becomes a focal point of that convergence. It's one of the last places where any kind of structured effort is still possible. One of the last places where the idea of a solution still feels within reach, and that makes it a target. When the next wave of conflict hits, it doesn't feel like just another battle. It feels like a turning point, the kind where everything that's been built up is at risk of being lost all at once. The white spikes aren't just attacking, they're overwhelming, pushing past defenses, breaking through barriers that were never strong enough to hold them indefinitely. And in the middle of that chaos, the mission doesn't stop. If anything, it becomes more urgent. The toxin has to be completed, secured, brought back. Because if it's lost here, if it doesn't make it to the past, then everything that's happened, every sacrifice, every risk, loses its meaning. Dan is forced into choices that don't have clear right answers. Stay and fight, push forward with the mission, protect the people around him, or prioritize the objective that could save countless others. The film doesn't simplify those decisions. It lets them sit in that uncomfortable space where every option carries a cost. And that's where his arc really comes into focus. Not as a transformation into some flawless hero, but as someone who's learning, moment by moment, how to carry the weight of those decisions without breaking under them. He's still uncertain, still human, but there's a clarity beginning to form in how he approaches what needs to be done. As everything reaches its breaking point, the narrative tightens even further. There's no room left for hesitation. The window for action is closing, and whatever happens next is going to define not just the outcome of this mission, but the trajectory of everything that follows. And yet, even in that intensity, there's a sense that the story isn't rushing toward a simple conclusion. It's building towards something more complex, something that acknowledges the cost of what's being attempted, the uncertainty of whether it will work, and the reality that even success might come with consequences that can't be undone. Because in a story where time itself is part of the conflict, nothing is ever just resolved and left behind. Everything echoes forward and backward, shaping outcomes in ways that aren't always immediately visible. And those echoes start to matter more than anything else, because once the immediate chaos peaks, once the facility is on the brink, the mission hanging by a thread, and every second feeling like it's being pulled in two different directions, you can sense the story preparing to pivot again, not away from the conflict, but deeper into its consequences. Because the truth that begins to surface, slowly but unmistakably, is that even if they succeed here, if the toxin works, if it's secured, if it makes it back, that alone won't be enough unless the present understands how to use it, where to use it, and more importantly, when. That realization reframes everything. The future isn't the endgame anymore. It's a warning, a blueprint of failure that can still be avoided, but only if the right pieces are put together in time. And getting those pieces back becomes the entire focus. The sequence that follows carries a different kind of tension than what came before. It's not just about fighting through waves of enemies or surviving another encounter. It's about extraction, about holding on to something fragile in the middle of a collapsing situation and making sure it doesn't get lost in the noise. The environment, already unstable, begins to feel even more hostile. The facility is no longer just a place of research. It's a target under siege. Structural damage escalates. Escape routes narrow. Communication becomes more fragmented, more desperate. And through all of that, Dan is forced to move forward with a clarity that wasn't there at the beginning. Not because he's suddenly fearless or fully certain, but because he understands what's at stake in a way that leaves no room for hesitation. The mission isn't abstract anymore. It's tangible, immediate, and tied directly to the possibility of changing everything. But that clarity comes at a cost, because the more he commits to the mission, the more he has to let go of something else, something personal, something that doesn't fit neatly into the objective, but matters just as much. And the film doesn't shy away from that trade-off. It doesn't pretend that you can have both, that you can save the world and hold on to every connection at the same time. There's a moment, quiet, almost suspended in the middle of all the chaos, where that conflict crystallizes, where the choice isn't framed as right or wrong, but as necessary or impossible. And the weight of it doesn't come from dramatic dialogue or sweeping music. It comes from the silence, from the understanding that whatever decision is made here is going to ripple outward in ways that can't be undone. And when that decision finally happens, it doesn't feel triumphant. It feels final. From there, everything accelerates again, but with a different kind of energy. It's no longer about discovery or understanding. It's about survival with purpose. Every movement, every action is directed toward one goal: get the toxin back. The extraction process itself isn't clean. It's unpredictable, filled with the kind of complications that have defined everything in this future timeline. Coordinates don't align perfectly. Timing is off. The window for return is narrow, and it's closing faster than anyone would like. And the creatures, relentless as ever, don't give them space to execute the plan without resistance. The final push becomes a race against both the enemy and the system they're relying on to escape. What stands out in these moments isn't just the scale of the action, but the focus. There's no distraction anymore, no secondary objective pulling attention away. Everything is narrowed down to this single thread, and the tension comes from how fragile that thread feels. When Dan finally makes it back to the present, back to a world that hasn't yet experienced the devastation he's just come from, it doesn't feel like relief. Not entirely. There's a shift, yes, a return to something more stable, but it's layered with everything he's carrying from the future, because now he knows. He's seen what happens if nothing changes. He's felt the cost of that outcome in a way that can't be explained to someone who hasn't been there. And that knowledge becomes both a burden and a responsibility. The toxin is here. The potential solution exists in the present. But the question is no longer whether they can fight the white spikes. It's whether they can stop them before the war even begins. And that introduces a completely new direction for the story. Because if the future is the result of something that hasn't happened yet, then the real battle might not be in the future at all. It might be here, in the present, in the decisions that are about to be made based on what's been brought back. The film starts to lean into that idea without fully resolving it immediately. It lets the implications settle. It allows the characters and the audience to sit with the weight of what's been learned. Dan's role shifts again, not away from action, but toward understanding. He's no longer just a participant in someone else's war. He's someone who's seen the outcome and now has to figure out how to prevent it. And that shift carries its own kind of tension, because stopping something before it starts isn't as straightforward as it sounds. It requires information, precision, and a willingness to act on knowledge that others might not fully trust or understand. The pieces are there, the toxin, the experience, the insight, but they're not enough on their own. They need context. They need a target. They need a way to connect what happened in the future to something that exists in the present. And as that realization begins to take shape, the story opens up again. Not in scale, but in possibility. Because now, for the first time, it feels like the future might not be fixed. Not guaranteed, not inevitable, just waiting to be changed. And that idea, that the future is no longer something you simply arrive at, but something you might actively rewrite, starts to change the emotional temperature of everything that follows. Because once Dan carries that knowledge back into the present, it doesn't just sit with him as information. It behaves more like pressure. Pressure that doesn't ease up. Pressure that keeps building in quiet moments, in conversations that suddenly feel heavier than they should, in the way ordinary life now looks slightly different because he's seen the version of it that doesn't survive. That contrast is something the film leans into without ever spelling it out too loudly. It lets you feel it in the background of every decision. And what's interesting is how the present-day storyline starts to reframe itself around urgency, but not the kind that feels loud or chaotic. It's a controlled urgency, almost bureaucratic at first. Meetings, debriefs, questions that don't have easy answers. People trying to make sense of something that breaks the normal structure of cause and effect. Because How do you explain a future war to a room full of people who haven't even seen the first sign of it yet? How do you convince systems built on evidence and timelines that something already determined can still be altered? That's where the story quietly shifts into a different kind of conflict. Not just humans versus creatures, but knowledge versus disbelief, experience versus theory. And Dan, sitting in the middle of that gap, becomes less of a soldier for a moment and more of a translator for something no one else has lived through. There's a subtle emotional strain in those scenes that doesn't rely on spectacle at all. It's in hesitation, in skepticism, in the way authority reacts when faced with something that doesn't fit within established frameworks. Even when the evidence is sitting right there, it still takes time for the idea to fully register. And meanwhile, the clock is still running, because the white spikes aren't a future abstraction anymore. They've been defined, understood, and that means the threat is no longer distant. It's approaching a point of emergence. The film starts to build this quiet sense that everything is moving toward a moment where the past and future will collide in a way that can't be avoided. That's where the narrative tension becomes more layered than just action stakes. It becomes about timing, about interception, about whether knowledge gained too late can still make a difference. Dan's relationship with his daughter also takes on a different texture here. It's no longer just emotional grounding. It becomes motivation with weight behind it. Every choice he makes in the present carries the shadow of what he's seen. Not in a melodramatic way, but in a constant recalibration of what matters and what doesn't. And the film doesn't simplify that internal conflict. It doesn't let him operate on pure instinct or pure logic. It keeps him in that uncomfortable space where both are constantly competing. At the same time, the scientific effort to reverse engineer the toxin becomes more central. It's not just about having the formula, it's about scaling it, understanding how it would function in real-world conditions, anticipating how an enemy that hasn't fully revealed itself yet might respond to it. There's a kind of fragility to that process. Every assumption carries risk. Every step forward depends on incomplete data. And yet, there's no option to slow down. Because waiting means accepting the future as it was shown. And that's not something the characters are willing to do anymore. As these threads begin to converge, the film subtly raises the stakes again, not through new threats, but through proximity. The idea that the future is no longer decades away, it's closing in, not in a literal time travel sense, but in terms of inevitability. Like a storm that's already formed and is just waiting to reach the shore. And that inevitability creates a very specific kind of tension because it removes the comfort of distance. You can't treat it as later anymore. It becomes soon. And soon demands action. Dan, increasingly aware of how fragile the timeline has become, starts to operate with a different kind of focus. Less reactive, more intentional. He's not just responding to events anymore. He's anticipating them based on what he's already lived through. But even that advantage comes with limitations. Because knowing the outcome doesn't always mean you can change the path to get there. Sometimes the structure of events resists alteration in ways that aren't immediately visible, and the film plays with that uncertainty without over-explaining it. It lets decisions carry ambiguity. It lets success feel temporary rather than final. As preparations accelerate and the effort to prevent the future war becomes more coordinated, there's this growing sense that everything is building toward a confrontation, not just with the creatures, but with the conditions that allowed them to exist in the first place. And that's where the story begins to expand again. Not outward into more spectacle, but inward into cause and origin. Because stopping a war after it starts is one thing. Preventing it entirely is something else. Something far more unstable, far more uncertain. And the closer they get to that possibility, the more the narrative starts to feel like it's standing on the edge of something irreversible, waiting for the moment where one decision determines which version of time actually continues forward. And that edge the story is standing on starts to feel less like a dramatic storytelling device and more like a structural truth of everything Dan has lived through so far, because once you begin operating with knowledge of an outcome, every small choice in the present suddenly carries the weight of something much larger than itself. That's where the final stretch of the story begins to tighten again. Not with a sudden explosion of new ideas, but with a narrowing focus. The mission is no longer theoretical. It's no longer just about preventing a distant catastrophe. It becomes about execution, turning fragmented knowledge into something actionable before the window closes completely. The effort to synthesize and scale the toxin continues under increasing pressure, and what makes this phase so tense isn't just the technical challenge. It's the constant awareness that time is no longer abstract. It's measurable. It's running out in ways that are no longer hypothetical. Every delay has a consequence attached to it now. And Dan, moving between conversations, briefings, and preparation phases, becomes less of a participant in a plan and more of a bridge between two realities. The future he's seen and the present that hasn't yet caught up to it. That position isn't comfortable. It isolates him in a way that isn't always visible on the surface, but you can feel it in how he navigates decisions. There's always something he knows that others don't, and that knowledge changes the rhythm of how he interacts with everything around him. What the film does well here is avoid turning that advantage into something clean or overpowering. It doesn't make him omniscient. It makes him burdened. Because even with foresight, outcomes are never guaranteed. Variables shift, conditions change, and the past he's trying to influence doesn't always respond the way he expects it to. That uncertainty becomes especially important as the final operational plan starts to take shape. There's a coordinated effort now, military, scientific, logistical, all converging around the idea that the white spikes can be stopped before they ever reach dominance in the future timeline. But coordinating something like that across time introduces complications that don't resolve easily, because the creatures themselves, even though they originate in the future, are still part of a chain of events that hasn't fully revealed its origin. And that means there are gaps in understanding that no amount of preparation can completely fill. You can plan for what you know. You can't fully plan for what you don't. And that gap creates tension in every strategic decision. There's always a question hanging underneath the surface. What if this isn't the full picture? What if the thing they're preparing for is only part of a larger system they haven't seen yet? At the same time, the emotional thread tied to Dan's family continues to exert its own quiet influence. Not in a way that interrupts the mission, but in a way that constantly reminds him why the mission exists in the first place. That balance between global stakes and personal stakes doesn't disappear. It intensifies. There are moments where that connection becomes almost indistinguishable from the broader narrative tension. Because saving the future isn't an abstract goal anymore. It's tied directly to whether people he cares about will exist in the version of reality that follows. And the film doesn't treat that connection as sentimental decoration. It treats it as motivation that has consequences. Because every step closer to resolution also increases the risk of loss. The closer you get to changing the outcome, the more unstable everything becomes. As the plan moves toward activation, the scale of coordination required becomes clear. This isn't a small intervention. It's an attempt to redirect an entire timeline based on incomplete knowledge gathered under extreme conditions. That alone gives the final act a sense of fragility, like everything could tip in either direction depending on how well the pieces hold together under pressure. And when execution finally begins, it doesn't unfold like a perfectly synchronized operation. It's controlled, yes, but never fully stable. There are disruptions, unexpected resistance, moments where everything nearly breaks apart before it can even fully begin. The white spikes, now no longer just a distant future threat, become something that feels immediate again. Not as an abstract concept, but as a present danger that resists containment. And that reintroduction of immediacy brings the story full circle in a way that reinforces how unstable the boundary between timelines really is. Dan, at the center of this final push, is no longer just reacting or adapting. He's committing. Fully. Knowing that whatever happens next will define not just survival, but the shape of everything that comes after. And that's where the tension reaches its most concentrated form, because there's no longer space for philosophical distance. No more room to observe the situation from outside. Everything has collapsed into action, consequence, and uncertainty all happening at once. The film doesn't rush through it, but it doesn't linger unnecessarily either. It moves with purpose, allowing moments of clarity to exist within chaos, giving weight to decisions without overstating their importance. And as everything converges toward its final outcome, what remains consistent is the sense that nothing here was ever truly simple. Not the war, not the time travel, not the relationships, not the choices. Everything is layered. Everything is connected. And everything carries forward into whatever version of the future survives what's about to happen next. And when everything finally compresses into that endgame stretch, the film stops feeling like separate threads running in parallel and starts feeling like a single, tightly wound chain reaction that's been building since the very first moment those future soldiers dropped into a soccer field and shattered the illusion that time was something stable and untouchable. At this point, the entire structure of the Tomorrow War is operating on consequence rather than setup. Every earlier idea, drafting civilians, the unstable future, the toxin research, Dan's connection to his daughter, the collapsing war in 2051, all of it starts feeding into the same narrowing corridor of events where there's no longer room for exploration, only execution. And what stands out in this final phase is how the film reframes scale. Earlier, scale meant cities under siege, massive creature attacks, global panic. But here, scale becomes something more precise and more personal. It's measured in seconds, in timing, in whether one decision lands correctly or slightly off, and how that ripple travels forward or backward through everything that's been set in motion. Dan is no longer operating in the space between confusion and adaptation. He's fully inside the logic of the situation now. He understands the structure of the threat, the limitations of the plan, and most importantly, the fragility of the window they have to change anything at all. That awareness doesn't make things easier. It makes them sharper, because knowing what's at stake doesn't reduce pressure. It concentrates it. The coordination effort to deploy the toxin becomes the final axis around which everything rotates. Military support, scientific input, and field execution all converge into a single point of dependency. And in stories like this, when everything depends on a single point, that's exactly where the tension lives. There's a very specific kind of anxiety the film leans into here. Not the chaos of battle, but the anxiety of precision under collapse. Everyone involved knows what happens if this fails. That knowledge doesn't need to be repeated. It's already internalized. So the dialogue becomes minimal, the actions more deliberate, and the stakes feel heavier precisely because they're no longer being constantly explained. And then there's Dan's personal thread, which never really separates from the larger mission, but now becomes fully integrated into it. The emotional weight of his journey isn't treated as a side story. It's embedded in every major decision. Because what he's trying to protect isn't just theoretical future humanity. It's a specific continuity of life that connects directly back to who he is in the present. That's where the film quietly shifts tone again. Not louder, not more explosive, but more grounded in inevitability. The sense that whatever happens next isn't just one possible outcome. It's the outcome all previous choices have been converging toward. When the final confrontation with the white spikes unfolds, it doesn't try to reinvent what's already been established about them. Instead, it reinforces it. Their behavior, their unpredictability, their sheer force, all of it returns at full intensity, but now filtered through everything the characters have learned. There's less confusion, but not less danger. If anything, awareness makes the encounter more intense, because now every mistake carries context. The action itself is structured less like isolated set pieces and more like overlapping systems breaking down and being rebuilt in real time. Plans are executed, disrupted, adjusted, and re-executed under pressure. Nothing stays stable for long. And that instability is exactly what makes the sequence feel alive rather than purely mechanical. Dan's role in this phase becomes less about leadership in a traditional sense and more about alignment. Being in the right place at the right moment with the right understanding of what needs to happen next. It's not about heroics in isolation. It's about being part of a chain that has to hold together under extreme strain. And as the toxin finally comes into play, there's a shift in tone that's subtle but important. The conflict is no longer just about survival or containment. It becomes about whether knowledge gained from a broken future can actually reshape the trajectory of the present. That idea carries weight beyond the immediate action because it touches the core concept the entire film has been circling. Whether outcomes are fixed or whether they can still be redirected once they're understood. Even in moments of apparent resolution, the film doesn't fully release tension because time travel narratives rarely allow for clean endings. Every solution introduces new questions. Every fix carries potential consequences that aren't immediately visible, and that lingering uncertainty is what defines the emotional aftertaste of the finale. Not whether the immediate threat is addressed, but whether the act of addressing it has truly changed the structure of what comes next. Dan's return to the present, carrying with him not just experience, but proof of possibility, reframes everything that came before it. The war he witnessed isn't just a future event anymore, it's a preventable outcome, a warning that can still be acted upon. But warnings only matter if they're believed, and belief, especially in systems built on certainty and linear time, is not automatic. So even as the immediate conflict reaches its conclusion, the story leaves behind something unresolved in a more philosophical sense. Not a cliffhanger in the traditional sense, but a question about preparedness, about whether knowledge is enough to overcome inertia, and about what it actually takes for a society to change course before it reaches a point of no return. And that's where the film ultimately leaves you, not in the aftermath of destruction, but in the space between awareness and action, where everything has been revealed, but nothing is guaranteed to change unless it actually is acted upon. And that lingering space, right there between knowing what's coming and actually being able to stop it, is where the story quietly stops being about a war in the future and starts being about something a lot more uncomfortable, something closer to how real systems actually behave when they're confronted with information they don't know how to absorb quickly enough. Because even after everything Dan has seen, even after everything he's brought back from the timeline ahead, the present doesn't instantly transform. It doesn't suddenly reorganize itself around urgency just because urgency is justified. Instead, it reacts the way institutions usually do, slowly, unevenly, with friction at every level. And that friction becomes its own kind of conflict. You start to notice it in how information spreads, in how decisions are delayed, in how certainty gets questioned, not because it's wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. There's this gap between lived experience and accepted evidence that never fully closes in time for anything to feel smooth. And Dan is standing right in the middle of that gap again, but now in a different way than before. In the future, he was adapting to chaos. In the present, he's trying to translate chaos into something actionable for people who haven't felt it yet. That's a fundamentally different kind of burden. Because experience alone isn't enough. It has to be communicated, interpreted, believed, and then acted upon. And every one of those steps introduces delay, distortion, or doubt. Meanwhile, the clock hasn't changed its behavior. It doesn't wait for consensus. So the tension shifts again, subtly but firmly, from can they survive what's coming to can they move fast enough to matter? And that question sits underneath every interaction from this point forward. What the film does well here is it doesn't suddenly turn the present into a simplified command center where everything clicks into place. It keeps it messy. There are disagreements about strategy. There are moments where priorities don't align. There's still a sense that even with the future as proof, people interpret risk differently depending on their position in the system. And that realism keeps the stakes grounded because it reminds you that preventing a catastrophe is never just about having the right answer. It's about getting enough people to act on it in time. At the same time, Dan's personal arc continues to evolve, but in a quieter register now. The urgency hasn't gone away, but it has changed shape. It's no longer just about survival or even prevention. It's about responsibility after exposure. Once you've seen a version of the world that doesn't survive, you don't really get to unsee it. It becomes part of how you evaluate everything moving forward. And that affects how he moves through the present timeline. Not dramatically, but consistently, in decisions that prioritize long-term consequences over immediate convenience, in conversations where he understands more than he can fully explain, in moments where he's clearly operating from knowledge that others don't yet share in full. There's also a growing awareness in the story that time travel itself isn't just a tool, it's a distortion, not just of physics, but of perspective. Once you introduce information from a future that hasn't happened yet, you change how people perceive the present itself. It stops being fixed and starts feeling provisional, like everything is subject to revision. And that can be destabilizing in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Because if the future can be changed, then nothing is fully settled. But if it can't be changed, then everything becomes predetermined. And the film deliberately avoids locking itself into either extreme, instead letting the characters operate in the uncomfortable middle ground where both possibilities feel plausible depending on what just happened. That ambiguity is what keeps the tension alive even when there isn't active combat on screen. As preparations move forward toward confronting the white spikes at their source, the scale of coordination increases again, but this time with more awareness of what failure actually means. It's not abstract anymore, it's not theoretical, it's been witnessed. That changes how people approach risk, even if it doesn't eliminate it. And the white spikes themselves, even though they originated in the future timeline, now begin to feel like a problem that belongs to the present as well. Not just something to be encountered later, but something that has already begun its trajectory. That shift in perception is crucial because it removes the comfort of temporal distance. There's no longer a clean separation between then and now. Everything is part of the same unfolding chain. Dan's role in this final alignment becomes less about discovery and more about convergence, bringing together what he knows, what he's seen, and what others are finally beginning to understand. And that convergence is what allows the final strategy to take shape. But even as things move toward resolution, the film doesn't let go of its central tension. Knowledge does not guarantee control. You can understand the outcome and still struggle to prevent it. You can see the future and still fight to change it. Not because certainty has been achieved, but because inaction is no longer acceptable. And that's what defines the emotional core of this entire stretch. Not confidence, but commitment under uncertainty. The closer everything gets to its final execution point, the more the story emphasizes timing, coordination, and trust. Trust in information, trust in people, trust in a plan that has been built from fragments of a future that might still shift depending on what happens next. And that's where everything ultimately converges, not in clarity, but in alignment. All the moving parts, all the separate threads, all the knowledge gathered across timelines coming together into a single attempt to redirect what was once considered inevitable, not with certainty, but with action. And once everything compresses into that final stretch of coordinated action, the film starts to feel less like a series of escalating events and more like a single sustained moment where every decision made earlier is now echoing at full volume, with no more buffer between cause and consequence. At this point, the Tomorrow War is no longer building its world, it's testing it. Everything that was introduced, explained, hinted at, or survived up to this point is now being pushed through the same narrow pressure point where outcomes are decided not by theory, but by execution under strain. And what stands out most in this phase is how the story strips away any remaining illusion of safety. Even in the present timeline, where things initially felt more stable, that stability is now fully gone. There's no separation anymore between before and after. The future isn't something waiting to happen. It's something actively trying to force its way into the present. The white spikes, once confined to a distant collapse, now feel like an approaching certainty rather than a potential outcome. That shift in perception changes the emotional texture of every sequence. It's no longer about discovery or preparation. It's about interception. Dan, carrying the full weight of what he's seen, operates in a space where hesitation is no longer neutral. It's costly. But the film never simplifies him into someone who's purely decisive or detached. Instead, there's still that human friction inside every choice he makes. He understands the stakes, but understanding doesn't erase emotion. It just makes it more concentrated. And that's where the final push begins to feel different from earlier action sequences. The scale might be similar: large environments, coordinated movement, high-intensity encounters, but the emotional framing is no longer about surprise or adaptation. It's about correction. Fixing something that has already been allowed to go wrong in one timeline and trying to prevent it from becoming reality in another. The operation itself unfolds with a kind of controlled urgency. Every part of it depends on timing that cannot slip. The toxin, now fully developed and ready for deployment, represents the last tangible bridge between what was learned in the future and what can still be changed in the present. But carrying it into position, deploying it correctly, ensuring it actually reaches its intended target, all of that exists under constant pressure from both the enemy and the fragility of the plan itself. And the film makes a point of not treating success as guaranteed at any stage. Even when things appear to align, there's always instability underneath. That instability is part of what keeps the tension alive right up to the final moments of execution. There's a kind of inevitability hanging over everything now, but it's not the comforting kind. It's the kind that feels like momentum that could still break in either direction depending on how one moment plays out. And that makes every beat feel heavier because nothing is fully locked in until it actually happens. Dan's presence in these final moments is defined less by action in isolation and more by continuity. He is the link between what was witnessed in the future and what is now being attempted in the present. That role doesn't make things easier for him. It makes them more layered. Because every step forward is also a reminder of what happens if it fails. And the film never lets that awareness fade into the background. As the final confrontation with the white spikes escalates, the action becomes more than just physical engagement. It becomes structural pressure, the environment, the timing, the coordination. All of it starts to behave like a system under stress, where every element depends on the others holding their place just long enough for the plan to complete. There are moments where success feels close enough to touch, and others where collapse feels equally imminent. That back and forth isn't just for spectacle. It's part of the film's underlying logic. Nothing is stable until the outcome is confirmed. And that uncertainty is what drives the intensity forward without needing constant escalation. The stakes are already absolute. The only thing changing is proximity to resolution. When the toxin finally comes into play in a way that begins to shift the balance, it doesn't feel like a sudden victory. It feels like the result of everything converging at once. Knowledge, preparation, timing, and sacrifice all intersecting in a way that finally produces a visible effect on something that once felt unstoppable. But even then, the film doesn't fully release tension. Because in stories built around time and consequence, resolution is rarely just about stopping a threat. It's about what remains after the threat has been addressed, and that lingering question, what kind of world is left when the outcome is altered, sits quietly underneath the final moments of action. Dan's journey, which began with confusion and disbelief at the idea of a future war, ends in a space where understanding and responsibility overlap completely. He's no longer reacting to events outside his control. He's actively participating in reshaping them, even if the full outcome is still unfolding. And that's where the emotional weight settles in. Not in triumph, not in relief, but in awareness. Awareness that time has been touched, that outcomes have been influenced, and that nothing moving forward will exist exactly as it once would have. The film closes this stretch, not by eliminating uncertainty, but by reframing it. Because even when a battle ends, the implications of what was changed continue forward, quietly shaping everything that comes next in ways that aren't immediately visible. And that's the final impression it leaves you with. Not a fixed ending, but a shifting one. A reminder that in a story built on time, nothing ever truly stays in one place for long. And that's where the film starts to settle into its final emotional aftertaste, not as a clean endpoint, but as a kind of recalibration of everything you've just witnessed. Because once the immediate crisis is pushed back and the white spike threat is no longer actively consuming every frame, what remains is something quieter, more reflective, and honestly, a little harder to pin down in words. Because the real consequence of everything in the Tomorrow War isn't just survival. It's the shift in how time itself is perceived. After everything Dan has experienced, the present is no longer just now. It's now with knowledge, now with pressure, now with the responsibility of a future that has already shown its worst possible version. And that changes how every remaining moment feels. There's a noticeable tonal softening in the way the narrative looks at its characters after the final major conflict. Not in a way that erases what happened, but in a way that allows the weight of it to finally settle instead of constantly escalating. The urgency doesn't disappear. It just stops being the only language the story is speaking. Dan's arc lands in a space that feels less like traditional victory and more like acceptance of responsibility. He's not walking away as someone untouched by what happened. He's walking away as someone fundamentally changed by having seen an outcome that most people will never fully comprehend, and now carries the burden of making sure that outcome doesn't become reality. That kind of knowledge isn't clean. It doesn't resolve neatly. It lingers in decisions that come after the credits would normally roll in another type of film. It affects how he sees risk, how he sees time, how he sees the fragile line between prevention and inevitability. And what's interesting is how the film doesn't try to over-explain that transformation. It trusts the audience to understand that once you've experienced a future collapse firsthand, your relationship with the present can't remain the same. Even the most ordinary moments start to feel slightly different in tone because you now know what failure actually looks like in detail. There's also a subtle shift in how the story frames humanity as a whole by the end. Early on, the future felt like something separate, almost like a warning delivered from another timeline. But by the conclusion, that separation has dissolved. The future is no longer distant. It's something that has already intersected with the present in irreversible ways. That creates a kind of uneasy duality in the ending tone. On one hand, there's relief that the immediate threat has been addressed, or at least significantly disrupted. On the other hand, there's an awareness that the conditions which created the threat still exist, just now, with intervention layered into them. And that's where the film quietly shifts from being a straight science fiction action narrative into something more reflective about cause and consequence. It's not just asking whether you can stop a disaster, it's asking what it takes to change the conditions that make that disaster possible in the first place. Dan's connection to his family becomes part of that larger reflection, not as a separate emotional thread, but as something integrated into the meaning of what was fought for. The idea of protecting a future isn't abstract anymore. It's tied to specific faces, specific lives, specific moments that were almost lost. But even that protection isn't framed as absolute. It's framed as effort, as intervention, as something that requires ongoing attention rather than a single decisive moment. And that's one of the more grounded aspects of the film's ending philosophy. It doesn't suggest that one victory permanently fixes the timeline. It suggests that awareness changes trajectory, but maintenance still matters. Visually and structurally, the final stretch avoids overstating resolution. There isn't a sense that everything snaps back into place. Instead, there's a sense of adjustment, like a system being nudged in a different direction, not fully rewritten. And that makes the ending feel less like closure and more like continuation beyond what we're shown. The story doesn't pretend to fully answer every implication it raises. It just closes the immediate loop it opened. What lingers afterward is less about plot and more about implication. If time can be reached, if futures can be seen, if outcomes can be influenced, then responsibility doesn't end with success. It extends forward indefinitely. And that's where the film leaves you, not with a final statement, but with a kind of quiet persistence, a reminder that even when the battle is over, the timeline doesn't stop moving. It just keeps unfolding, shaped slightly differently by what was learned along the way. And when you sit with that idea a little longer, you start realizing the film's ending isn't really about wrapping things up at all. It's about shifting the weight of everything that came before into a quieter, more lingering space where consequences don't disappear. They just stop being immediately visible. Because what the Tomorrow War ultimately leaves behind isn't a traditional sense of closure. It leaves behind a kind of awareness, one that continues to operate even after the action is done. The future isn't gone. It's just no longer guaranteed to unfold the same way. And that distinction matters more than it first appears. There's this interesting after effect in how the story reframes Dan's journey once the immediate threat is no longer pressing directly on the present timeline. You start to see that his experience in the future wasn't just a mission. It was a point of contact between two versions of reality that were never meant to overlap. And now that they have, even briefly, everything moving forward carries traces of that collision. The present isn't untouched anymore. It's informed. And that information becomes a kind of silent influence on everything that follows. What the film does in its final stretch, without ever explicitly stating it, is shift the narrative from preventing extinction to managing divergence. Because once you've introduced knowledge from a future that can be altered, you're no longer dealing with a fixed outcome. You're dealing with branching possibilities. And that introduces a kind of philosophical unease that sits under the surface of the ending. If the future Dan saw can be changed, then it was never truly fixed. But if it was fixed, then what exactly did they change? The film doesn't resolve that tension in a rigid way. And honestly, it doesn't need to. The point is the instability of certainty itself. Dan's return to a more grounded version of life doesn't erase what he's experienced. It reframes it. Ordinary moments now carry a different texture. Conversations, decisions, even silence feels slightly different when you've seen how quickly everything can collapse under pressure from something no one in the present has fully encountered yet. And that's where the emotional undercurrent of the ending really sits. Not in resolution, but in altered perception. There's also a subtle thematic thread about preparedness that quietly anchors the final tone. The idea that awareness alone isn't enough. You have to act on it, and act early enough for it to matter. That creates a lingering sense that the real battle isn't confined to the moments we see on screen, but extends into everything that happens afterward. Because if the future can be influenced, then every delay, every hesitation, every misunderstanding in the present carries its own weight. Not in an immediate cinematic sense, but in the slow unfolding of cause and effect that defines the story's core logic. And that's part of why the ending feels slightly open, even when the main conflict is resolved. It doesn't close the loop so much as redirect it. It suggests that what's been achieved is not final victory, but a shift in trajectory, one that still has to be maintained, understood, and followed through. Dan's character by the end exists less as a traditional action protagonist and more as someone who has become a carrier of information between timelines. That role is heavier than it sounds because it comes with a responsibility that doesn't really end. Knowing what happens doesn't automatically prevent it. It only creates the possibility of prevention, and that possibility is fragile. The white spikes themselves, while pushed back from immediate dominance, remain part of that fragile equation. The film doesn't treat them as something fully erased from existence. It treats them as something whose trajectory has been interrupted. That distinction matters because interruption is not the same as elimination. So even in victory, there's caution. Even in success, there's monitoring. And that's where the story settles, not in triumph, but in vigilance. The final emotional note isn't loud. It doesn't try to redefine everything that came before it. Instead, it leaves you with a sense of continuation that extends beyond the frame. Like the story hasn't stopped. It has simply moved out of view. And maybe that's the most honest way the film could have ended, given its premise. Because once you introduce time as something that can be crossed, observed, and influenced, you also introduce the idea that endings are never as final as they appear. They're just points along a timeline that keeps moving, quietly, persistently, regardless of whether we're still watching it unfold. At this point, there isn't really a next event the film is pushing toward, in the traditional sense. What it leaves you with instead is the aftermath of understanding, and that's a very different kind of storytelling space to sit in. Because after everything Dan has gone through in the Tomorrow War, the most lasting shift isn't about battles fought or enemies defeated. It's about the way certainty itself gets eroded and rebuilt in a different shape. The future he saw isn't treated like a fixed destination anymore, but more like a warning that has already done its job simply by being witnessed. And that creates a strange dual feeling in the final stretch of reflection. On one hand, there's relief that an immediate extinction level outcome has been disrupted. On the other hand, there's an awareness that disruption is not the same as resolution. It's a correction, not a conclusion. Dan's return to normal life, if normal even applies anymore, carries that tension in subtle ways. The world around him hasn't changed overnight in a visible, dramatic sense, but his understanding of it has. And that mismatch between external stability and internal knowledge is where the final emotional weight of the story quietly settles. There's also something interesting in how the film frames responsibility at the end. It doesn't treat saving the future as a single heroic act that completes a journey. It treats it more like the beginning of a longer awareness cycle. Once you've seen what's coming, you don't really get to unsee it, and that changes how every future decision gets filtered. Even the idea of victory becomes less absolute. Instead of we won in a final, sealed sense, it feels more like we intervened in time. And intervention implies maintenance, vigilance, continuation. It implies that nothing is permanently solved, only redirected. That's a subtle but important tonal choice, because it keeps the story from hard closing into something overly neat. It respects the complexity of the premise it built. Time travel, future knowledge, and extinction-level stakes don't lend themselves easily to clean endings. And so the final impression is not one of finality, but of suspended momentum. The threat has been pushed back, but not conceptually erased. The knowledge remains. The awareness remains. And those two things continue to shape how everything is understood going forward. What's left behind, more than anything, is perspective. Dan is no longer just someone reacting to events. He's someone who has seen the endpoint of those events and is now living in the space before they occur. That position fundamentally changes how he relates to everything around him, even if the surface of life appears unchanged. And that's where the film ultimately lands emotionally. Not in closure, not in reset, but in altered awareness. A reminder that once time itself becomes part of the battlefield, nothing ever really goes back to being simple again. The story doesn't end with a full stop. It ends with a shift in understanding, and that shift quietly keeps moving forward, even after the screen goes dark. At this stage, there really isn't another chapter of plot unfolding to continue in a literal sense. The story of the Tomorrow War has already completed its narrative arc on screen, and what remains is more about how everything settles in your mind once the intensity fades. And that settling is actually where the film's final impression becomes most interesting. Because when you strip away the action, the time jumps, the creature warfare, and the constant urgency, what you're left with is a very simple but uneasy idea. Knowledge changes responsibility. Once Dan has seen the future, he can't return to being the version of himself who didn't know. That shift is permanent, even if the timeline is technically altered, and the film quietly builds its ending around that permanence rather than around spectacle. It's why the final tone feels less like a blockbuster ending and more like a transition point. The conflict has been addressed, but the implications continue. The world hasn't reached a final state. It has reached a different trajectory, and that distinction is doing a lot of the emotional heavy lifting in the last stretch. There's also something worth noticing about how the story treats uncertainty at the end. It doesn't erase it, it absorbs it. Even after intervention, even after success, against the immediate threat, there's no full guarantee that everything is permanently safe. And that's intentional, because the premise itself doesn't allow for absolute closure without breaking its own logic. Time travel narratives rarely do, and that's where Dan's journey quietly lands, somewhere between resolution and continuation. He's no longer in crisis mode, but he's also not free from consequence. He exists in that in-between state where awareness has permanently changed how he sees the world, even if the world itself looks more or less the same on the surface. That's really the final emotional residue the film leaves behind. Not victory, not defeat, but perspective. A sense that the future is no longer distant or abstract, but something fragile that can be influenced, but never fully controlled. And once that idea settles in, the story doesn't need another scene, another twist, or another escalation. It's already done what it set out to do. It has shifted how time feels inside the narrative, and that shift is what stays with you after everything else fades out.